If you were with us last time, I was talking about the Revolution of 1800 and how Thomas Jefferson was able to get elected even though he managed to share an electoral victory with a guy named Aaron Burr. We know that the Revolution of 1800, as Jefferson would later call it, was a bloodless transfer of power, and it was really one of those things that set us apart from the nations of old Europe and some of these other great civilizations of the past. The idea that two great, powerful men could claim victory, both legitimately, and it was a nation of laws that ultimately determined who would be the next president of the United States. Today what we're going to talk about is the Jeffersonian presidency, and there's several things that I need you to be mindful of when it comes to Thomas Jefferson's time in the White House. First and foremost, as you should recall, Thomas Jefferson was not a huge fan of industrialization, whereas Alexander Hamilton wanted America to become a nation of factories and industry. Thomas Jefferson felt that that would lead to dependency. In other words, you could never really be independent, free, if you will, if you continuously depended on your employer for a job. If your employer said, look, this is the way it's going to be, if you depended on him for that job, there was very few other alternatives that you had other than to comply. The world that Thomas Jefferson wanted to give America was an agrarian world, a farming world. Now, what is it that you need to become a nation of farmers? Well, you need lots and lots and lots and lots of land. And the simple fact of the matter was, in places like Virginia, in places like Massachusetts, much of the land, certainly all of the really prime locations when it comes to real estate, that had already been bought up for years and years and years. If we're going to become a nation of farmers, what we need to do is expand. Now, one of the things that you're going to find in American history traces, the idea of this anyway, traces its roots back to the 1890s. A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, is the American frontier, our western frontier, has always been the driving force of American history. That was the thesis that Frederick Jackson Turner put forward in the late 19th century. Well, you can see a clear-cut case of this with the Jeffersonian presidency and our impulses to expand into the West. Now, can you think of any kind of conflict or any kind of trouble that might be on the horizon when it comes to the American empire moving from the East into the West? One of the things that I bet you're thinking of right now is conflict with Native Americans. This isn't anything that we haven't seen before. We saw this with the Proclamation of 1763, when the British voluntarily said we will stay off of Native American territory in the Great Lakes region, considering they did not want another war. We'll see it again in 1783, and as you should know, one of the provisions of the Treaty of Paris was that the British gave the United States all that territory west of the Appalachian Mountain Range, which the British Empire had pretty much left alone. It had let the Native Americans do their own thing. Native Americans are going to have a very different understanding of what that territory is and who it belongs to, and clearly we're going to see some conflict between the United States government and the Native American peoples that live there. For the time being, though, guys, what I want to do is I want to give you a couple different approaches in terms of how Native Americans should be dealt with as far as official government policy was concerned. One of the individuals that had thrown his opinion out there was a guy by the name of Henry Knox. Henry Knox was a military man, and what he favored was assimilation. In other words, bring Native Americans into the mainstream American fold. This could be done in a number of different ways, but one of the things that he was implying was franchising them. In other words, making them citizens, giving them the right to vote, things of that sort. Other individuals really rejected that notion on cultural levels, on political levels, on racist levels, the idea that you could never take Native Americans and bring them into the Anglo world and really have any kind of lasting peace for that. At the end of the day, there were other opinions, especially like those of General Wayne, who went by the nickname Mad Anthony, And as evidenced by the Battle of Fallen Timbers, what Wayne favored was the complete destruction, more or less the extermination, of the native societies west of the Appalachian Mountain Range. Well, all of this is really going to come to a head in 1895 with the Treaty of Greenville. Now, when you think Treaty of Greenville, I want you to think of the present-day state of Ohio. What the American government basically said was, if you, Native Americans that occupied that particular stretch of territory, if you gave the American people, the American government, that territory that we now think of as Ohio, we would stay off the rest of that area. In other words, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, we wouldn't touch it anymore. The Native Americans agreed, and that's what became the Treaty of Greenville. They gave us what is now Ohio, and in return for that, we said, we're going to stay off of the rest of your territory in that region. The American government saw that more or less as a temporary peace offering. In other words, there would come a day where you would not see that anymore, and that day would be somewhat in the future. Native Americans, radical thought here, thought that they had signed an agreement with the American government and that would last forever and ever and ever. So clearly what you're going to see as early as 1895 with the Treaty of Greenville is fundamental misunderstandings when it comes to what the future holds as far as Native Americans and land rights, their ability to hold on to their ancestral homelands. We'll pick up more with that in future lectures, but for the time being, I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson and the establishment of the Supreme Court. Now keep in mind, guys, the Judiciary Act of the late 18th century, that did not establish a Supreme Court. More or less what it did was set up a series of federal appellate courts where they would make the decision on the final appeal. We don't, in 1800 anyway, we don't have an official Supreme Court. Now that will change in 1803. Now, if you recall, one of the reasons that Thomas Jefferson ran for president in the first place was because he was appalled by some of John Adams, the previous president, some of his policies regarding constitutional law. The idea that the First Amendment could basically be vented by the president, had to be suspended simply because he didn't want to face any kind of criticism, was absolutely appalling to Thomas Jefferson, and it led him to run for president and win. Now, John Adams is not a guy that's simply going to go away politely, and really in the 11th hour of his presidency, he appointed 16 new federal judges, 16 new judges that would be essentially interpreting the law. So when a case came before one of these federal appeals courts, it would be one of John Adams's appointees that would be making the decision. Now think about this. Every time a president makes a selection for a judge, be that federal appeals court or Supreme Court in our day and age, it's a really big deal. Why? Are judges human? Yes, they are. Do human beings, judges included, have personal biases, political orientations, ways in which they look at the world? Of course they do. That's part of what makes them human. So my point in telling you this is the people that a president like John Adams appoints to federal judge positions are probably going to look at the world the same way that he does, are probably going to have various biases that are similar to Adams, are probably going to have a political orientation that is much similar to Adams. In other words, these 16 midnight appointees, as they came to be known, were more or less going to, hopefully anyway, for the Adams administration, were hopefully going to protect those laws that had come out under John Adams' time in the presidency, which was one of the reasons that Thomas Jefferson ran in the first place. The Secretary of State under the incoming administration, Thomas Jefferson, was a guy named James Madison. And Madison was so furious at these 16 midnight appointees that he vowed not to deliver their judgeships. In other words, you can appoint all the judges that you want to. I am not going to commission their positions on the bench. One of those individuals was a guy by the name of John Marbury. And in 1803, he sued James Madison in federal appeals court, and he won. The decision that was entitled Marbury versus Madison, it did a number of different things, but there's really two things that I want you to be mindful of. So let me get the first one of those things out of the way right now. What it said was, James Madison, I don't care how you may feel about this on a personal level. The simple fact of the matter was, a sitting president appointed judges. It is your duty as Secretary of State to deliver on those judges, right? In other words, we are a nation of laws, and it might not matter how you feel about this personally. You have a job to do, so therefore do your job. So those 16 judges aren't going anywhere. That's point number one. Point number two is far more important. What Marbury versus Madison leads to, and I want you to write this down, Marbury versus Madison leads to a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court that you think of today traces its roots back to the Marbury versus Madison decision. Marbury versus Madison not only sets up a Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. In other words, if you appeal a court ruling, the highest court you can take it to, the final court that you can take it to, that would be the Supreme Court. So, anyway, the Supreme Court, in addition to being established through the Marbury versus Madison decision, is given the power of judicial review. I bet there are a few of you out there that like to play the board game Monopoly. And back in college, I had a law professor that challenged all of his students to a game of Monopoly. And he would say he would give you every deed in the game. In other words, you can have Boardwalk, and you can have Park Place, and you can have all the railroads, and you name it, you can have it. You could have every piece of property, houses, hotels, you could have every dime in the bank. I mean, seriously, he would give you every dime. The only thing that he wanted in return is the ability to interpret the rules. So, for most of us, when you pass go, you collect $200. That has traditionally been the way that we've understood that. What my professor was driving at was, if he gets to interpret the rules, he can say something to the effect of course it means collect $200 and then pay me, your opponent, an additional $400. The point I have in telling you this is that there's a tremendous amount of power that comes along with interpreting the law. What the law means ultimately will affect an incalculable amount of American lives. We've seen it in our lifetime. The Supreme Court makes a decision, and it has an unmistakable impact on the way that we live our lives as Americans. I'm not pressing this issue for you enough. What this means is, when Congress passes a law, under the provision of judicial review, the Supreme Court would get to say whether or not Congress has power to establish that law in the first place. A quick example. In 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Affordability Health Care Act, right? Popularly or commonly known as Obamacare. What the Supreme Court is saying is, under the provisions of the Constitution, the Obama administration is able to go ahead and pass a law like this. So it's saying it's okay. Read the Constitution. Read it twice. Tell me where the Supreme Court gets to knock down laws. It's not going to be in there, not in any kind of explicit, direct way anyway. It doesn't say that the Supreme Court gets to knock down, eliminate a law, and it also doesn't say that the Supreme Court gets to make a law. But think about this. Has the Supreme Court in your lifetime, in my lifetime, made a law? Yes, it has. Right? When a case goes in front of the Supreme Court and it makes a decision, for example, the 2010 decision in Citizens United, what it is doing is it's saying this is permittable and this is not. For example, in Citizens United, it determined that corporations like McDonald's and Walmart were people, and therefore they had rights like me or you. And one of the rights that you and I have is the right of free speech. Well, how does McDonald's express itself politically? Well, the Supreme Court says what it does in that case is it spends money. It goes ahead and it gives $1,000 to the guy that's running for mayor of Dallas, or drain commissioner, the city of San Francisco. You get the idea. So corporations are people, and money is free speech, and the institution in the American legal system that gave us this law was Marbury versus Madison and the establishment of the Supreme Court. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court gets to make laws, but it does it. And it's been doing it more and more frequently as we've entered into the 21st century. That's what I need you to understand about Marbury versus Madison, a terribly important development in American legal history. Now, back to Jefferson and land and expansion. You cannot talk about Thomas Jefferson without talking about the greatest achievement of his presidency, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Okay? Now think back to the earlier days of our class when I was talking to you about about the establishment of Louisiana. That was a French territory. Okay? It was essentially part of the French Empire in North America. At the dawn of the 19th century, the early 1800s, you're seeing chaos breaking out in Europe. Primarily, what you're seeing is the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte is invading various European countries, and toward the end of that process, he's trying to reestablish the French island colony of what has now been known as Haiti. Keep in mind, Louverture Toussaint had led a slave rebellion, kicked the French out for all intents and purposes, and established the modern-day nation that you and I call Haiti. Napoleon was trying to get it back, and this worried the daylights out of Thomas Jefferson. Why? Well, Napoleon's in our backyard. Haiti's not that far from the mainland United States. And here's a guy with a reputation for invading other countries. Do you see where he's going with this? Thomas Jefferson sent American diplomats to Paris as a way to try to purchase the port city of New Orleans, right? Former French city. Thomas Jefferson wanted to buy it because he saw that as a way to protect the interior of the United States, to use New Orleans as a shield. Well, not only was Napoleon interested in selling New Orleans, he was also interested in selling basically the entire rest of the Louisiana Territory. Why? Nobody knew what it looked like. Thomas Jefferson really didn't know what he was buying, and Napoleon didn't know what he was selling. But nonetheless, the French ministry was strapped for cash, and Napoleon was very motivated, so to speak. Thomas Jefferson jumps at this possibility of adding so much territory. In other words, this really wasn't something that he was over in France trying to do to begin with, but once the opportunity presented himself, he very much seized the opportunity. Why? Well, this is an opportunity to double our land mass with one stroke of the pen. The simple fact of the matter was, we purchased the Louisiana Territory and all those resources. Think of Kansas and Nebraska, that's the breadbasket of the world. The state of Louisiana, the future states of Arkansas, right? That was Missouri. That was a ton of territory there, and the resources that will eventually reap out of there are going to be incalculable in terms of the American economy. Okay? But what Thomas Jefferson thought he was doing was creating an empire for liberty, right? That this would be the opportunity for Americans to spread out into the West, to become that farming agrarian republic that he had dreamed about before he became president. There's a couple problems with this, and let me begin with the problem of we don't know what we just bought. I mean, it could be great, valuable farmland, and it could be chicken soup. Nobody knows because nobody has penetrated the interior to tell us. To that end, what Thomas Jefferson does is he commissions two of his military buddies, a guy named Meriwether Lewis and another guy named William Clark, to lead these expeditions west of the Mississippi River, along the Missouri River, to essentially tell us what we just purchased. In other words, what Jefferson wants is reports and maps and documents that will illuminate what is west of the Mississippi River and what we can expect from that territory that we've just purchased. There's a very good piece in the Transforming America documentary video section that you should check out when you have the time. It's relatively long. It's approximately 10-12 minutes long, so that's a little bit long by our standards, considering most of those lessons are around about 5-10 minutes. But at any rate, it's very much worth your time when it comes to what the Lewis and Clark expeditions meant. I just need you to understand that they were missions commissioned by Thomas Jefferson to report what was west of the Mississippi River. And when they came back, what we got were accurate maps. We got descriptions of what the land was like, including what crops might flourish. We got reports on the Native Americans that were inhabiting that part of North America. Okay? Now, back to the controversial aspect of the Louisiana Purchase. As I said before, Jefferson felt that he had created an empire for liberty. As it turned out, Thomas Jefferson had opened the door for an empire for slavery. You think about the states that I just mentioned. Both Louisiana and Arkansas would eventually become slave states, thus expanding slavery's geographic boundaries. Furthermore, Kansas and Nebraska, although they went on to become free soil states, there was a tremendous uproar in terms of whether or not slavery could go there. So at the very least, Thomas Jefferson touched off a firestorm of political controversy when it comes to where we can go with slavery and where we could not. He also, inadvertently anyway, almost touched off a civil war. Not when you're thinking. I'm talking about the early part of the 19th century. You remember our good friend Aaron Burr? The guy that had tied Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. Well, he's going to come back and he's going to make his presence felt once again in a very foggy, somewhat misunderstood plot to take over the Louisiana Territory. What Aaron Burr is accused of doing in the early part of the 19th century is leading an expedition into the Louisiana Territory in what we now call the state of Texas, to try to take it over and establish a new country. So from the very beginning, this has implications of massive amounts of internal conflict, civil war. That's what I'm really trying to say without saying it. And for those of you that stay with us in the class and are diligent, you'll know that we really accelerate our speed to civil war really in the 1850s, when we not only add more territory, but we begin saying, you know, what that territory is going to be. Is it going to be a free state? Is it going to be a slave state? And who gets to decide what that is? Part of what opens that door is Thomas Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory. So is this a good thing? Yes, it's a great thing. It's doubling our landmass. Is it a bad thing? Well, yes, at the same time it also is, considering it's also revamping this whole issue and discussion that we've had with regards to slavery, where it can go and who gets to say. So for the time being, that's where I'm going to stop this section. When we come back, we're going to be talking about American foreign policy, especially as it relates to the West.